The entrance of Neptune into Aries is an instrumental part of the astrology of the second half of the 2020s that will reshape reality in dramatic ways, making the recent past feel like a distant memory. And fittingly, Neptune has had an extraordinarily dramatic entrance into Aries on March 30th of 2025, one day after a solar eclipse in Aries, a couple weeks after a total lunar eclipse in Virgo that was opposite Neptune and set off the Neptune Saturn configuration that's forming. We're coming to the end of a Saturn and Neptune cycle right now that's taking place near the transiting north node of the moon. And we have both Venus retrograde and Mercury retrograde happening at the same time as the eclipses in the same signs activated by the eclipses and moving back and forth between conjunctions with Neptune and Saturn. Hey, I'm Gray Crawford. I'm a professional astrologer. And if you're looking for astrological guidance right now, my books are open for consultations. So I'll put a link below for you to schedule a consultation with me. I'm also a teacher and I give numerous talks at different astrology groups around the country. And I also do webinars. And I've been really fascinated by this approaching transit of Neptune in Aries for a while. Earlier this year, I did put together a webinar on Neptune in Aries called Through the Looking Glass with Neptune in Aries. So I'll put a link below for that as well in case you'd like to purchase that and get a deeper dive into the meaning of Neptune in Aries than I'm going to present today. Now, as I mentioned, one of the big factors going on with Neptune in Aries right now is the approaching Saturn and Neptune conjunction. Now, I'll talk a little bit about that today, but I'm going to focus more in on the meaning of Neptune in Aries because it is extremely important and extremely catalytic within this powerful configuration that will be forming this year between Neptune and Saturn in Aries, Pluto in Aquarius, and Uranus in Gemini. This year, we will experience Neptune in Aries from March 30th until about October 22nd. Then Neptune will come back into Pisces for one final time until the end of January, around January 26th, depending on your time zone of 2026. Neptune will come back into Aries where it will stay until 2038, and then it will be passing back and forth between Aries and Taurus into about March 23rd or so of 2039. Now, Neptune changing signs is important because of it staying in a sign for roughly 14 years. But Neptune leaving Pisces to enter Aries is unusually significant because of Neptune crossing over that world axis point of 0 degrees Aries. In this image, we can see an image of Earth and this sphere around the planet, symbolizing how we can project the celestial equator out into outer space. And where that point intersects with the ecliptic, which is that apparent path of the sun, which is essentially our zodiac belt that we track all the planets in astrology, that point of intersection is 0 degrees of Aries in the tropical zodiac. This is the point of the Aries equinox, which is the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere when the sun gets to 0 degrees of Aries, like it did recently, usually around March 20th, March 21st, sometimes March 19th. We have equal day and light all around the planet. Now, we also do when the sun comes to 0 Libra. And then, of course, at the solstices, 0 Cancer and 0 Capricorn, we have extremes, either the most extreme day of light, the most extreme day of darkness. And on these days, the sun gets to its greatest height and greatest depth in declination in reference to our own orbit. And so when a planet crosses this world axis point in the tropical zodiac, it is unusually important because it has come to this intersection of the equator and the ecliptic. And in the northern hemisphere, this has a symbolism of great increase of influence because the sun at this point is passing from southern declination to northern declination to go up to its greatest height of declination later at the summer solstice when the sun gets to zero Cancer in the tropical zodiac. And there's something about this point, it's held to be very important in certain schools of astrology and talked about as being this point that we all share in the world. You can imagine how this intersection of the equator and the ecliptic could bring a planet's influence much more strongly into this earthly material plane of reality that we experience. And so, because of this, this makes Neptune coming here unusually important. And because a transiting north node of the moon was also just here, because we have Venus retrograde and Mercury retrograde, we just had this eclipse. This entrance of Neptune into Aries on March 30th is just so extremely powerful because we've had the sun crossing over the Aries equinox point, Mercury retrograde going over it, Venus retrograde going over it, the nodes went over it recently. And so it is just this incredibly dramatic entrance of Neptune into Aries that is bringing this great influence of Neptune into our reality much stronger. We'll talk a little bit more about that meaning of Neptune, but Neptune is a tricky planet in many ways. A lot of times you will hear astrologers talk mostly about Neptune involving illusion and delusion, dissolution of what was formerly solid. And that is true about Neptune, but it is only capturing one side of the picture of Neptune. And it's important to keep in mind the fact that all of us are living within many illusions here in this material life that we have here. And Neptune, in helpful ways, can open us to other dimensions of reality and contacts with spiritual realities that our limited perceptual framework sometimes doesn't let us get in touch with. And while that can lead us into escapism at times, that can lead people sometimes into illusion, it can also lead us into greater truth and understanding. Now, one of the things about Neptune that is, of course, tricky is that Neptune isn't so much focused on the practical. Neptune doesn't have a great sense of limits or boundaries. Now, positively, Neptune can help us go deep within to this sense of soul purpose and connection to spirit above and really get us in touch with what do you really want or who do you really want to be if you didn't have the limitations or the constraints you have in your life. And this can be very powerful. And this can be another part of what's going on right now, even though many things in the world are breaking down with this influence of Neptune right now. Many things are going on that can make people feel despair and disillusioned. But there's also something coming out of this process to be connecting with and new directions, new purpose. What's so powerful about this time is that coming behind Neptune, getting closer and closer to Neptune right now, is Saturn. And Saturn, in some ways, is very much an opposite planet in meaning to Neptune because Saturn does bring the limits and Saturn does bring the boundaries and the constraints, but also Saturn can be a patient, thorough builder of foundation and creator of worlds. And so, as Saturn and Neptune are coming closer and closer together, as things are falling apart, we also have an amazing opportunity to patiently construct more of our ideals and our idealized purpose in the world. So, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So, as Saturn and Neptune come together, they fuse their meaning, and this can be difficult. The way things are so dramatically changing in the world with all sorts of new power dynamics changing, threats of borders changing, we'll likely see this all continuing because historically Saturn and Neptune time periods have consistently gone along with borders changing, power dynamics changing. There's often a great revolution that comes up, often centered on people and in a sort of Saturn way of Saturn going with the marginalized and those on the outskirts of the power and authority. They're swept up in this flood or tide of Neptune. And when people have reached the point of not having the things they need materially or economically, that's what, especially when we've seen it happen time and time again, they rise up and revolt. And sometimes that's successful, sometimes that rebellion is crushed. And so we've seen this happen different ways. But there's often this great time of new idealism and new movements that can sweep us up into these larger movements of change that arise in these Saturn and Neptune times. And so it becomes very important to find your center and stay in the center of your integrity during these Saturn and Neptune times because of the great idealism that can just sort of run amok. And while it is a time where we can turn dreams into reality and patiently build upon our ideals, because there's so much change, there's so much uncertainty going on, people often try to also control. That Saturn mechanism comes in of becoming overly controlling in the face of the great uncertainty. And often that's through trying to enforce their ideals on other people. And things can swing to great oppression and great fundamentalism and persecution. And so there's been a number of witch hunts and the Inquisition happening during Saturn and Neptune times. At the same time, there's been great spiritual epiphanies and revelations. So it is an enormously powerful time of change coming in here because of Saturn and Neptune fusing together as they come together on that same exact world axis point. So this is sort of the Saturn Neptune conjunction to end all Saturn Neptune conjunctions. It's one that likely we can already tell it's going with this sense of a new era coming in because at the same time Pluto being in Aquarius in a harmonious sextile to them later this summer, Uranus comes into Gemini, and especially next year in July of 2026 especially, there'll be a very powerful configuration formed with numerous planets. So right now, we do have an interesting time to adjust to just having Neptune and Aries. Because they're so close together, this image here of Saturn and Neptune glyphs fused together is still going to be something we're going to be experiencing. But because Saturn's at the end of tropical Pisces, Neptune's at the beginning of tropical Aries right now, we do at least get a little bit of a chance to acclimate and adjust to Neptune in tropical Aries without Saturn also being there. That will change once Saturn comes into Aries on May 24th. And then this summer in the Northern Hemisphere, in the middle of July, right when Saturn is stationing retrograde and Neptune has already stationed retrograde, they're going to get really close together, basically like 13, 14 minutes away from each other. And it's going to effectively feel like they have formed a conjunction. There's going to be a very powerful Saturn Neptune influence coming in at this time, but they won't exactly get there to form the exact conjunction. They'll then pull back. They'll both go back into Pisces. We'll get some sort of experience of going back into this Piscean realm, and then that's going to be something else to get into relationship with because something is going to sort of propel us forward in this Aries way, like I'll talk a little bit more about today. And then we get pulled back into the Pisces realm later this year. And then next year, they both come back into Aries and they form that conjunction on February 20th of 2026. There's so much more that can be said about the Saturn and Neptune cycle, and it is an incredible cycle to research in terms of all the incredible historical changes that have gone on for, I mean, literally, you can go back thousands of years and track this, and you'll see things consistently show up. The last time we had the conjunction was in 1989. This was when the Berlin Wall fell. We had the dissolution of the Soviet Union and numerous revolutions breaking out in places like Poland and Czechoslovakia. This was also very importantly when the World Wide Web was proposed. And if you track the Saturn and Neptune cycle since that inception of the World Wide Web back at the last conjunction in 1989, you'll see pivotal turning points with the story of the internet and the incredible power that the internet holds at this time as that cycle is coming to an end right now. If you go back to the previous conjunction, 1952, 1953, similar but in different ways to the World Wide Web, we had a television era emerging at this time and people becoming connected through their television screen, which of course also, just like the internet, led to great manipulation and propaganda and brainwashing. But we had that inception of the television era. Many other things happened at that time as well. If we go back to the 1917 conjunction, that was a time of World War I drawing to a close. It included the Russian Revolution. It included a lot of big movements for women to get the right to vote in the United States of America, which then did happen following that conjunction. If you go back to the previous one before that, in 1882, we have Thomas Edison lighting up a block in Manhattan and this idea and reality of electric light and being able to light up our streets and communities with electric lights and the dawning of the electrical age. Hopefully, you can get just a sense with those few examples how much reality can change during Saturn and Neptune time periods. And so that's what we're going to be experiencing. But again, today I want to focus more on the meaning of Neptune. So Neptune has been in Pisces since 2011. And although we have Neptune in Aries for most of the rest of the year, remember, around October 22nd, Neptune will come back to Pisces. So there's something really important about this year with Neptune, that we get this inception and this huge spark and this kindling of fire that will likely set things off like wildfires in the world with new movements, new directions, new inventions, new ideas and ideals and collective movements erupting out of all that mixture. But then things will end up coming back to Pisces for one final time before Neptune goes back into Aries for good in late January, around January 26th of 2026. Neptune has a very important role to play in all of our stories and how our personal narratives play out, how we come into relationship with our memories and who we are in our world and our sense of identity. It's enormously important. And oftentimes Neptune's a little bit more in the background and not as front and center and in our face as it is right now. And so that's one of the reasons why it's going to be really important to come more into relationship with Neptune and bring more awareness, because it can very much connect us in with unconscious forces, both the collective unconscious and great collective memories and sort of the archetypal field underlying reality can come up with Neptune, but also our deep personal unconscious, our deep well of memory. But as I mentioned, it can also, as part of all of this, really help us remember who we are or become who we want to be in the world in a more creative and fulfilling way. Now, while Neptune has been in Pisces, the big difference between these two signs, there's a few. One is Pisces is a nocturnal sign of night that's inwardly directed, that is watery, that is the home of Jupiter, that is the exaltation of Venus and has this internal, watery, dissolving, very much. Pisces does have boundaries, but Pisces is one of those signs that is more unbounded. And so, in the way that it's also this mutable sign of many things happening at once and being able to move in between different tasks and different paths simultaneously and being this watery, inwardly directed sign, Pisces is incredible at being open to all these different influences and being able to mix and blend and synthesize all of these things together and get in touch with this deeper dream and this deeper vision of things. And so that's one thing, no matter what you've experienced in these past 14 years with Neptune and Pisces, it's going to be worth your time to get more in touch with however you have had this sense of your reality change and how have you been able to get this deeper sense of who you truly are and what you truly want to create with your life. A massive difference between these two signs is that outwardly fiery, cardinal, focused, focalized movement of Aries, combined with Neptune spending all this time on that world axis point, right, and coming in so supercharged with eclipses and Venus retrograde and Mercury retrograde. There is a sense of something in Aries erupting. And so while Pisces can put us in touch with this inner sense of soul and vision and creative potential, Pisces isn't always as good about making it happen. Pisces can stay in that realm sometimes of having the great vision and not making it a reality, which is where that spark and fire of Aries is going to be so powerful. And so we will feel these spirited sparks of inspiration, galvanizing action, focusing that imaginal fire of the mind on targets like a spear thrust by Athena, who, as I'll talk about, is very much a tutelary deity of Aries. That blazing heat of Aries, that cardinal nature of initiation and fast moving change and speed of events is going to really propel us forward towards our dreams and towards whatever we are idealizing. That inner fire will be get stronger and stronger and animate us and make us more interested and motivated and determined to take action. And so it's going to be really important to gain more clarity for what do you want to take action about, what do you want to create with your life, and how can you use this Aries fire with Neptune in inspirational ways that are going to be part of your integrity, part of your true authenticity, and your true soul purpose in the world. Another big difference with Aries and Pisces is just the fiery nature of Aries. And it's important to keep in mind, in case you're not as familiar with traditional astrology, that in traditional astrology, fire was always seen as the most spiritual element in many ways because of that great ascent of fire, a fire ascending to the heavens above. And we can think about how having an altar at home, you may light a candle or tend the fire or burn incense. There is this yearning of fire for the heavens above. And so with Neptune and Aries, it is going to be a very spiritual placement, and we very well could see great spiritual awakenings, new religious movements, even. Now, with a combination of Saturn, it does put us at risk of religious fundamentalism, but I also think there's going to be great spiritual awakenings happening at the same time with this quality of fire. Now, the other thing about Aries is that it is the domicile of Mars as well as the exaltation of the sun. And so, this quality of the sun and this solar exaltation, this idealization of the solar, as well as this quality of Mars will also be coming through with Neptune in Aries. One of the things about this, especially in terms of this being the fiery domicile of Mars, is that we can imagine and we're already seeing how this idealization of the heroic, this idealization of those that take action. But we can also think not just about warriors and fighters, but also guardians and protectors, all types of people in these types of roles being idealized, as well as ourselves feeling more of a call to take action and also to protect what's most important to us. An amazing thing about Neptune in Aries is how many great changes through warfare or unrest or rebellions or protests or reforms have taken place across history. I'm sure you've heard numerous astrologers already talk about how the last time Neptune went into Aries in 1861 was a day after the US Civil War started. But that wasn't even the only civil war happening then. There was a German Civil War, there was one in Japan, there was one going on in Poland. And you see this going all the way across time. There are so many examples, too many to really go through here. But there is this quality of something coming in with Aries and this fiery thrust and change and something being cleaved open and divided, and then something new coming in. And as part of this, this can actually at times be helpful in the ways that sometimes there have been many examples of something that is some sort of oppressive or dominant orthodoxy, that some type of ruling principle or ruling empire that has gotten too much control and too much power. And there's something about this Neptune and Aries quality coming in that overturns it. And it can create then a period that is more chaotic and divisive in some ways. But this ends up leading to really important change. And in some cases, this has been great liberation movements. And so it's really a mixture across time. It's not all negative and all terrible. And so I think on fortunate, helpful ways to think about this with your consciousness and what you really want to be bringing into reality with Neptune and Aries is that liberatory potential of Neptune in Aries and that fire element, that Promethean fire to help emancipate and break things up that haven't been working and bring something new into reality. A figure with Neptune in Aries that I find very fascinating, including in relation to this ideal of the heroic warrior and guardian, is Plato. It's not absolutely certain when Plato was born, but when you look at the time period most scholars seem to think Plato was born in, he would have been born with Neptune in Aries. And in fact, it's possible he even could have been born with Neptune in Aries and Pluto in Aquarius. It's going to depend on when he's born, because in the general time period, you'll see people give for when he may have been born. It's a time when Pluto was moving back and forth between Aquarius and Capricorn. I will most likely make another video about the relationship between Neptune and Aries and Pluto in Aquarius another time. But in case you saw my previous interview with Rosie Finn, who wrote this book, Persephone's Revolution, about Pluto and Aquarius, we talked about in that video how there is a 3-2 relationship between Pluto and Neptune, so that every 2 times Pluto goes around in orbit, Neptune goes around 3 times, and there is a sync between Neptune and Aries with Pluto in Aquarius. It's very powerful to track through time. And it essentially happened around the time that we think Plato was born. So why is Plato so important in relation to Neptune and Aries? Well, one thing is definitely this idealization of the warrior caste. In the Republic, when Plato is talking about this ideal society ruled by these philosopher kings, a fundamental part of this is this idealized warrior caste of these idealized guardian warriors. There is no way this ideal society of Plato can happen the way it's described without these powerful warriors who are defending and protecting the realm. Now, again, what do we have here? We have philosopher kings. So we're also getting this idea. I'll talk a little bit more about this with the exaltation of the sun, of these idealized, supposedly benevolent rulers who are philosopher kings who know best. They have this divine philosophical, spiritual connection, and they should be given this ultimate control and leadership and authority. And that's going to then enable them to lead this idealized society. These are other themes we're going to be seeing coming up more and more. I think you can already notice how this is something that's coming up already with just all the things that are already happening just as Neptune's coming into Aries right now. We can also think about this great daimonic force of Eros that in the symposium is described as this ladder to the divine, this force of Eros, this fiery force of love. Oftentimes, Eros is described as this great fire that sort of inspires us, it arouses us to take action, it sweeps us up into what we consider to be joyful or beauty. And as we follow that, it can lead us to this divine, ladder to the divine and spirit. That cave allegory of Plato, this is such a huge concept that's going on right now. I'm seeing it everywhere. There is that simulation model idea that seems like it could eventually be turned into some new movements that people are really believing in. And when I look at some of those ideas, I've seen some of the underlying interesting concepts that connects into it seems to be is this idea of Plato's cave. But whatever happens, I definitely think Plato's cave connected to Neptune and Aries is incredibly important. And again, that goes with, people being in this cave, thinking reality is just these shadowy illusions on the wall. And then this ability to discover the true sun and connect in with this eternal realm of deeper truth and archetypal field underlying everything. And that through this mind and through this access to the divine, we can come into touch with true, beauty and justice and so on. There's something about this that I think is also extremely Neptune in Aries, and I'll be very interested to see how that might feed into whatever types of philosophical or spiritual or religious movements take shape. Another thing that's really interesting with Plato is this idea of the myth of Atlantis. And one of the things that's so fascinating about the myth of Atlantis, which also is involving, military and these champion Athenian Greek warriors who are able to protect and fight off this all powerful, consuming Atlantis empire. But this idea of Atlantis also and this ancient, advanced technological society and what happened to them potentially is also something very alive. And that warning of that Atlantis myth is also something very applicable to modern society and all of our technological change and inventions and climate change and so on. Now, the other thing about Plato with the myth of Atlantis that's really fascinating is his ancestor Solon. So it's often said that Solon is part of the ancestral lineages of Plato. And there is this sort of mythic legendary story of Solon. He was one of the ancient divine sages of Greece, having traveled to Egypt, and that Solon was the one that was told this story of Atlantis. The reason Solon is pretty fascinating is that at the time Solon was alive in 594 BC, there was a Saturn and Neptune conjunction in Aries. Now, that Saturn Neptune conjunction in Aries in 594 BC was not zero Aries like we're going to have now, but it was pretty close. It was only about 2 degrees of Aries, so it was a very early on conjunction. Now, if you haven't heard of Solon, the reason most people tend to have heard of Solon is he's often said to have been one of the innovators or originators of democracy. And it's this idea that democracy comes from that ancient culture and civilization of Athens. And Solon was, again, one of these ancient seven sages whose sayings and aphorisms we can still find at the Oracle of Delphi. And that idea of Athenian democracy is often said to have very much come from him. Now, there's all these stories about Solon, which are also really interesting that I think we can think about in relation to the upcoming Neptune and Aries transit, as well as the Saturn Neptune conjunction in Aries. Because pretty fascinatingly, there was the Saturn Neptune conjunction in 594 BC, and that time period of 594 BC is when it is typically said that Solon came into power and he was made the archon or the chief magistrate of Athens. And what was so powerful about him was it said that he made all of these reforms. So there had been a previous ruler, Draco, that had all these really harsh laws, including using the death penalty for many offenses. And Solon came into power, overturned those laws. He instituted things like debt relief, which have been a very important reform. Again, there's this sense that he was involved in democratic reform in some way. And then it's said that after he instituted all these reforms, he ended up surrendering his power. And that's when he went into traveling and went to Egypt, which is where he legendarily, heard this story of Atlantis. Now, the other thing about Solon, though, which is so important related to Neptune and Aries being the exaltation of the sun, is that it's often said by Plutarch that Solon was given this extreme autocratic power by the people of Athens in order to bring about these reforms. So again, it's even though he's said to have been this institutor of democracy, Plutarch also writes about how he was given this sort of autocratic power in order to make these changes come about that then, leads to things later on. But, again, he's also described by Aristotle as like the first people's champion and so on. But I think that's this idea of this being at risk of greater authoritarianism and greater autocratic power. This is all over the news right now. It's something a lot of people are really concerned about. And it is something to be concerned about because it is a theme of Neptune and Aries. And of course, ideal with this sort of idea is that we have a very powerful leader who is like a philosopher king, who's connected to the divine in some way that really can bring about these powerful reforms. But of course, there is an incredible other side to this that it can lead to great authoritarianism and great oppression. And the difficulty with Saturn and Neptune time periods, like we're going to be experiencing, is in this face of uncertainty, people can project their power on other people or look for somebody else to play that powerful role. And so that's going to be something we're going to have to really be watching and making sure we're staying in our own power, our own empowerment, protecting people who are in our community, and so forth. Now, with this exaltation of the sun comes all sorts of interesting ideas, one of which is this idea of this ideal, benevolent ruler who's rooted in the divine. And even though there are numerous civil wars and numerous schisms that overturn old orders very consistently with Neptune and Aries, we also often see central authorities claiming great power. So, for example, previous Neptune and Aries time with Pluto and Aquarius was a Protestant Reformation. There was the movement of Martin Luther with the 95 Theses that then led into this period in around 1524 when there was a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction in Pisces with the North Node in Pisces. But there was also not just a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. What they didn't realize at the time was it was also a Saturn-Neptune conjunction and a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. They were all together. And there was a great peasants' revolt and revolution that happened at that time. But this was also when the printing press is helping to distribute the ideas of Martin Luther. Martin Luther's translating the Bible, and it leads into the transition of Neptune in Pisces into Neptune in Aries, which happens at the same time of Henry VIII wanting to throw off the Catholic Church, and be able to marry who he wants. And while on one hand, Henry VIII is sort of throwing off the power of the Catholic Church, he's also creating the Church of England that he's in charge of as a king. So he's rebelling, but he's also claiming great power. So there's something like this that we'll see with Neptune in Aries. But what's so powerful about it, I think of with that exaltation of the sun, right? The sun's the center of our system. We have these ideas about reality. Nowadays, we have all these scientific theories about what is reality. It used to be maybe more of a religious reality principle holding things together. But what's that central organizing principle? And something about the movement of Neptune into Aries has many times gone with these central organizing principles of reality being overturned. So literally the heliocentric revolution with Copernicus was a Neptune and Aries time period that also had Pluto and Aquarius. And so that is, if you just think about how powerful that is to go from thinking everything is revolving around the earth to realizing we're revolving around the sun and all the change that goes with that. It's so powerful. During times of the Italian Renaissance, during times of the Protestant Reformation, during times of the Age of Enlightenment, during the time period that Newton gets his optical theories, right? The sun is all about light and like eyes and vision, and this overturning old theories of color and realizing that white light is like the spectrum of color and all these other ideas that came about with that. All of these are just some examples of how powerful this can be. Again, I already spoke about this idea of the spiritual element of fire and connecting to that sense of nous or that noetic realm. That's also something that will be really powerful. The other thing, though, to keep in mind with the sun that I think is very powerful is we think about the sun, during day and the sun breaking, dawn, bringing light in the morning, but the sun sets, the sun goes into darkness. And there is that ancient Egyptian idea of every night the sun descending into night and battling this chaos serpent before rising again and bringing forth this new dawn of creation. And that solar descent into night very much goes with the mystery initiations and going through this sort of dissolution and regeneration and initiation into something, into this mystery of creation. This is also a theme that I think is very alive with Neptune and Aries and goes with all of the great changes it can bring. And then just another idea too, I mentioned here on this slide, this idea of scientific and technological breakthroughs with energy sources, some of which going on now are things like nuclear fusion that are basically replicating the reaction of the sun and stars that could bring this sense of limitless energy. This would be a very Neptune and Aries thing if there are some significant developments with this in the years ahead. And then in connection with the sun's exaltation in Aries, which goes with Apollo, if we bring Neptune in, which very much, among other things, Neptune can go with Mnemosyne, who is the goddess of memory and like this deep collective eternal memory. The muses are her daughters, and the muses bring artistic inspiration and creative inspiration. They sort of ignite our memory for these deeper truths and beauty and creation that can never be forgotten. And we have within us, and we have that ability to reignite that memory, and that can come through our invention and our creativity. Aries is an incredibly creative sign. And so there is all sorts of inspiration and creativity that can come through with this transit of Neptune in Aries. The last time Neptune was in Aries, there was great works of literature that are very fitting for Neptune in Aries, such as Les Miserables and War and Peace, as well as Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Demons, Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, in which he very much centers that work on Apollo and Dionysus, which is, again, very fitting for Neptune and Aries. There's also the Little Women by Louisa May Alcott with that feminine, independent, very Aries figure of Joe as the lead character, as well as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, which also has that central heroine of Alice. And these works are also very fitting for Neptune and Aries, including having these powerful women main characters, which again is this sense of that usual order of the male hero being overturned. We've also had numerous examples of mysticism with Neptune and Aries. Two beautiful examples of that include Sappho as well as Mirabai, who was a Hindu mystic poet and Krishna devotee who wrote their poetry during times of Neptune and Aries. And so Neptune and Aries can be an extremely creative and dynamic transit for us to experience, while at the same time bringing up great concerns about those that are claiming greater power and stepping into more authoritarian and potentially oppressive forms of power. But we can also imagine how there'll be great forces of resistance rising up against that. And so, in this climate, there will probably get much more intense with greater collective movements getting sparked. It's going to be really important to find your center and not get carried away by things that are going to end up being out of your integrity. Just to re emphasize that creativity of Aries and what we can discover with Neptune and Aries, I want to quote from Manilius, who was a first century astrologer poet, and his text Astronomica. About Aries, he wrote, "The ram, who is rich with an abundance of fleecy wool, and when shorn of this with a fresh supply, will ever cherish hopes. He will rise from the sudden shipwreck of his affairs to abundant wealth, only to meet with a fall. He will yield his produce for the common benefit, the fleece, which by 1,000 crafts gives birth to different forms of gain. Now workers pile into heaps the undressed wool, now card it, now draw it into a tenuous thread, now weave the threads to form webs, and now they buy and sell for gain garments of every kind. No nation could dispense with these, even without indulgence and luxury. So important is this work that Pallas herself has claimed it for her own hands." This quote there's a lot here to unpack and talk about, but we are getting this image of creativity and this renewal of creativity, renewal of resources, this ram that grows wool that can be shorn and then created into crafts and weaved together. And so there is this sense of the ram and Aries, just like that sun rises every day and brings about a new dawn of creation. That even though there are these great rises and falls and sudden shipwrecks, as it's being described here, and the wool is shorn off the ram, it grows back, and there is this renewal of creativity. Now, there's something about that with all the technology and all the innovation going on. We know this is going to be just an incredibly creative time period, but there are, of course, all sorts of warnings about this that we are going to have to collectively come into a relationship with. The other element of this that Manilius is connecting is Pallas Athena. And I think she is also important to consider as a guiding daimonic figure for this experience of Neptune in Aries. And another part of that same text, Manilius names her as the tutelary deity of Aries. She is the daughter of Metis. Metis is that cunning wisdom we need to interface with that shape-shifting, illusory realm of Neptune and the way it brings us into that Maya of illusion that we navigate in this material realm. And fascinatingly, Pallas Athena, she's born from the head, which is Aries, right? Born from the head of her father Zeus, because he had swallowed Metis, that goddess of wisdom. And she, like her father Zeus, is also this shapeshifter. And there is this shape-shifting quality she has and this ability to strategize, as well as the fact that she is this goddess of weavers and crafts and arts and tools of civilization. In ancient Athens, there was a contest between her and Poseidon. And while Poseidon brought the salt spring, Athena brought the olive tree, and she was chosen to be the goddess of Athens because of that usefulness of the olive for so many elements of building a civilization. And so hopefully there is this sense of that intelligence and wisdom of Athena that we can access and use as guidance in good ways during this transit. I know sometimes people also talk about Athena as this archetype of woman being pulled into the patriarchal role of power and losing herself in that patriarchal system of power and hierarchical power structures. And that's, of course, also a warning that we could think about here. But in positive ways, I want to think more about Athena as that shape shifting guide of the heroic who can help us navigate through whatever impossible, difficult situations we come into contact with, and hopefully helping us, most of all, guide us into that essential integrity of soul within us. Because just like Athena loves to guide heroes on quests, it's very likely that all of us, in one way or another, will be called to pursue some type of quest in one way or another with this movement of Neptune into Aries. And so I hope that in this time period of adjusting to it, whatever new movements and fiery surges of passion and creativity start emerging for you with that, that you can gain clarity for that work and direction and purpose that truly matters for you, and that fire of Neptune in Aries can help you forge and construct whatever structures you will need to express that purpose through in your life. If you'd like help navigating through the astrology of the coming months and year ahead, I'd love to meet with you through an astrology consultation to talk to you about it and help you discern how to work with all of this great change coming with the astrology in ways that are empowering and purposeful for you. So I will put a link below to how you can book a consultation with me. I'm also going to put a link below to my Patreon. I have a Patreon community. There are monthly meetings that happen depending on what tier you're on. On one tier, the Cedar tier, we have a monthly meeting just after the new moon where we look ahead to the lunar cycle and just the transits coming up, and people can ask me any questions they want. And we also will talk about each other's charts. There is also an Oak tier where we have a monthly class. And for a while now, we have been covering different fixed stars. The next fixed star we will be talking about is Arcturus. And then if you are on the lower level, the Alder tier, you get access to additional content I put on there. For example, I have been making videos for each week and forecasting the astrology coming ahead, and content like that that I don't end up putting onto YouTube, that only goes out to my Patreon, as well as getting access to different discounts and other things. So you can check out my Patreon below. Thank you for listening, and I hope you find new inspiration with this entrance of Neptune into Aries.